Thanks, Leora. Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all today. I'm actually going to do very little in this session because I'm delighted to have been able to prize away some really busy and fantastic people from their day jobs for an hour who are working on ECF at the moment to speak from their experience and to look ahead to the opportunity and the challenge in the sector that this policy brings. So we know that the single biggest factor in improving children's educational outcomes is the quality of teaching. We also know that high quality teaching is an equaliser. Expert teaching is particularly important in helping those children from disadvantaged backgrounds to achieve outcomes that are closer to those of their more advantaged peers. We also know that the best way we can improve the quality of teaching is through high quality professional development. It's a better bet than grading lesson observations, assessing teachers against teacher standards, or performance related pay. But we also know that the quality and consistency of professional development across the sector is variable and often doesn't lead to the impact that we need it to have. So an exam question for us is, how do we fundamentally improve the quality of teacher professional development at a system level? Yesterday, the government published the new statutory guidance, which comes into effect from September, entitling, through the ECF, every new teacher who joins the profession to a 2-year structured programme of support and development with funding at a school level to have additional non-contact time to focus on professional development. In the last 2 years since we launched Ambition Institute, we've been working closely on the ECF from the genesis of an idea through the ECF pilot we ran to a few hundred teachers last academic year and the early rollout this year to over 4,000 participants across the country. And we're now looking ahead to September and the opportunity to work with many more colleagues in the system. Really pleased to be able to share this experience with you today. We think that ECF has huge potential to be impactful in the system, but it's new, it will be challenging in places, and in particular with so much energy being diverted into the national effort around the pandemic, there's a recognition that we've got a lot to do collectively ahead of September. So my colleagues here today, Genevieve and Kyle, have been working, living, breathing, sleeping ECF for the last 2 years now. And they're going to talk through an overview of the programme, the policy, and how the delivery partnerships with school trusts will work. I'm particularly grateful to Genevieve, who's unwell today and is here all the same. So please bear with her if she has to go on mute and have a coughing fit. From September, ECF will be delivered in the system through a combination of lead providers, so organisations like Ambition, Teach First, EDT, alongside delivery partners, organisations such as teaching school hubs, school trusts. So I'm really grateful that 2 of our early rollout delivery partners have agreed to join us today to share some of their experiences and advice going forward. I'm looking forward to hearing Layla and Patrick reflect on their experience so far, helping to share that knowledge looking forward to September. So we only have a short time, and there's probably at least a day's worth of information discussion that we could have, which we'd love to pick up perhaps in another session. As we go through this hour, we'll be keeping an eye on the chat, trying to respond to as many questions as we can. So please do ask away. We'll also take away your questions from today and work with Leora and Steve to see how we might be able to respond better as we build our collective knowledge in the sector ahead of September. So without further ado, I will hand to Kyle Bailey, Associate Dean of Learning Design at Ambition, who's going to kick us off.
Great, thanks so much, Tom. I'm going to just lay out what we're going to discuss today. So before I do, Kyle Bailey, Associate Dean, I've been leading on the design of our Early Career Framework program since early 2019. I'm going to be talking about what the Early Career Framework is, a bit of the context, a bit of the document itself before handing off to Genevieve to discuss a little bit more about what the reform, the entitlement looks like. And then again, as Tom said, really excited to have some of our partners from early rollouts to talk about some lessons learned, discuss it from a trust perspective, and advice on how you can best prepare for September 2021. Before we get into the early career framework, I think it's just really important to provide some context So as you can see here, I think it's really important that we understand that there's a huge problem that sits behind some of the thinking of the ECF. As a sector, we aren't keeping enough of our teachers, and we need to ensure that they have even more opportunities to develop and grow, particularly early in their career. So from 2017, there was a review commission that include wider consultation, interviews, stakeholders and roundtables. What fell out of this was what you can see here, the teacher recruitment and retention strategy. One of the exciting things about this document is it included a section on the strengthening of support for teachers early in their career. And so as a result, the DFE committed to several following things, which I'll give you a second to read here on the next slide. So again, doing a bit of history here, 2019, the DFE came out with the document and they basically committed to these three things. One was the framework document itself, which I'll talk a little bit of detail here now. Second, obviously the lengthening of the NQT year to the early career teachers, 2-year commitment. And then I think excitingly, it's not just about the early career teachers. It's not just about extending the entitlement, but support for mentors and an aim to build capacity in the system, which I think is just really, really great. It's not just the framework, the content, the evidence base, but also an opportunity for us to level up as a sector. So what is the ECF? And if we go on to the next slide, I'll give you a second to have a quick read. So one of the things when I talk to schools, when we induct schools, teachers, mentors, leads, that I think is a bit of a misnomer is that there is the early career framework as a document, as an evidence base, and then there's further reforms and entitlements that go with it. I think it's really great that it is an evidence base. It helps to support the entitlement, but you can see here that there are different sections. Now, different schools, different providers, different people that interpret the early career framework cut that evidence base slightly differently, but this is the recommendations from the document itself. So you'll see that it covers content that are aligned to the teaching standards, but aren't meant to be used as an assessment tool. I'm going to go ahead and share one of the slides now from the early career framework and just pull out a couple key features of the document itself. So I'll give you a second to digest, and then I'll pull out some key features from the slide. So a couple things that I want to mention. You'll see here that the document itself is organized by the teaching standards, but they're not necessarily meant to be delivered in that fashion. So in this instance, you'll see that this is attached to standard 1, set high expectations, but oftentimes schools, trust providers lump that in with potentially behavior management, but also interpret that in slightly different ways. So considering how high expectations might look like in assessment, curriculum, or in other aspects of their wider 2-year entitlements to cover the framework. A couple other key features that I want to pull out is that there is this common language that is being provided for all teachers in their 2 years. So you notice in the left-hand column that there's a learn that statement. So what this is drawn from is from an evidence base that is included in the framework itself. So the EF, a roundtable of school professionals, sector organizations came together to create this document and basically set out, here's what we think the research, the evidence base is that we want all teachers to learn. So that's there for teachers, schools, trusts to get their head round in terms of what we want to teach all teachers, but also attached to those accessible research articles that we think represent best bets for the sector. Now, in addition to that, obviously we want our teachers, our sector to know more, but we also want them to be able to implement some of that learning into their classroom practice. So throughout the document, for each section, for each standards that these learn that and learn how to statements are organized, you'll see that there's also sections that include learn how to. And again, the entitlement isn't just an entitlement to learning, but an entitlement to ensuring that that learning is being applied with fidelity to our teachers' classrooms. Again, the early career framework is a really exciting opportunity. The framework itself, I would recommend again and again to go back to familiarize yourself with. A lot of the schools teachers that I've worked with have said there's not a lot of things that are surprising there. They might have some different language choices, but it's been really helpful and useful to have those articles, those research pieces that underpin each of the sections. So at the end of the document, for each standard, there's a corresponding section with both a list of all of the research for, in this instance, set high expectations, but also asterisks, opportunities to signal the most accessible, the most usable, kind of prioritized areas that they'd want teachers, mentors, schools. So we go to the next slide. So again, I've mentioned this, that the framework itself isn't the entirety of the reforms, but there is this entitlement to additional support and training. And I try to use entitlement as much as possible because it's not meant to be an assessment tool, but it is also hopefully providing some time, space, system support and capacity to ensure that what I think is a really great document can come to life, really live and breathe in our schools. Obviously, one of those pieces in terms of the investment is the document itself, but there's also a couple other things that the DFE have committed to, of which one of them is what's called the Core Induction Program. So you can see here a link, and we'll be sure to share this link in the chat. But essentially, what the DFE has done as a result of their commitment is produce what's called the Core Induction Program that exists freely available to schools on the DFE website from 4 of the early rollout providers. Now, this Core Induction Program covers a range of different materials that schools, trusts can use and dip into. So included in those are first a sequence. Essentially, the DFE asked the providers to recommend a journey through the learning to build a curriculum for those statements across 2 years. So again, different providers interpret that in different ways, but essentially this is a way that we could envisage teachers and mentors working through the content to ensure that that learning sticks. So again, an interpretation links to the early career framework. All 4 providers were asked to provide a sequence. The next thing, again, unsurprisingly, we want teachers to learn, so we also want to provide them self-study materials. Again, all 4 providers had a set number of hours, how they cut that curriculum, how they interpreted that, how they delivered that for teachers. All 4 providers' self-study materials are on the DFE website. Again, Genevieve will get into a little bit more about the entitlement in terms of time and how teachers might use those self-study materials. But a really useful tool for schools, trusts to get their head around what some of these things are. And one of the exciting things about sequence and self-study materials, and then the other 2 that I'll talk about here in a second, is the degree to which these were quality assured. So obviously the 4 providers went away and interpreted this curriculum, sequence, self-study materials for schools, but the DFE and the ECF also quality assures these. So these were sent off back in early 2020. They were quality assured. Changes were made throughout to ensure that it again was maintaining that fidelity to the framework itself. So making sure that it was drawing on the research base, the evidence base from the framework, and that it was accessible and usable to schools. In addition to the materials for teachers in terms of the self-study materials, there was also again this commitment to supporting mentors. We're aware that there's really great mentoring already happening in schools, but there's also an important need to ensure that all mentors are given the resources, materials, time, and space to get better. So again, each of the providers have published their mentor training materials. So again, Genevieve will talk a little bit in more detail about what this mentor commitment will look like, but essentially in the first year, mentors will get an opportunity to meet on nearly a weekly basis with their teachers, and they need support to do so. We're aware that the early career framework, the evidence base, might be something that mentors are really well versed in, but these materials are really aiming to ensure that they're best placed to translate some of that to their context. And then lastly, one of the things in terms of the core induction program, free materials that are on the EFU website, are what's called early career teacher training session outlines. So essentially what these are overviews for what a live, in-person, over Zoom session might look like to support with the learning for the early career framework content. So in many instances, this involves teachers in schools, teachers over Zoom, working through an area of the early career framework, working with colleagues across potentially their trust or potentially other trusts to unpack some of that, learn how-to statements that they might have touched on in the self-study materials, they might have touched on with regards to their conversations with their mentors. But again, it's also an important opportunity for them to understand what best practice looks like, not just in their school, but again, the early career framework is ensuring that that induction period into the profession is really taking place. So those are the free materials. Obviously, Tom mentioned that for national rollout, there will be additional materials. So on top of the early career framework core induction program, there's a full induction program that talks a little bit more about those training sessions, bringing those to life, delivering those, and then there's some mentor sessions as well. Now, the core induction program is freely available, but it's not the be-all, end-all of the framework. So one of the things that the framework is also going to do in the future is aligning with what's called the Teacher Training Core Content Framework, and it's also serving as a stepping stone or a part of the newly reformed MPQs that are coming into place from September 2021. So essentially, if you look at the new ITT Core Content Framework, or if you have looked, you'll see that it's very, very familiar in terms of some of the language. We're teachers, we work in education. We know that we need to come back to some of these key pieces. We need to think hard about what that looks like in our settings. So again, the degree to which we've covered an area versus the degree to which we really need to build, revisit. That's something where the language is very similar, but that evidence base is shared so that we're not having conflicting messages, that we're assuming that we're building capacity across the system, from inducting people into the profession all the way up to the executive leader MPQ document. That research base obviously is built on, but is helping to support this common language across the sector. The content within the provision, and I know that Layla and Patrick will talk about this, but it's just really, really important that we're aware, that schools are aware, the sectors are aware what the content is, but also how that mirrors up with schools' current provision. Schools are doing really great things. We've talked to schools that have some really great provision. And I hope that you've mentioned, you might have noticed some of the really intentionally subtle language around this isn't about necessarily recreating the wheel. This is about ensuring that we're capturing the really great practice that's already happening in schools, thinking hard about how we're going to ensure that this content comes to life, and ensuring that we're talking about the same thing. So again, really great things that are already happening in school, an increase in this entitlement, and hopefully some additional support to the great mentoring that we're already seeing in schools. But again, making sure that that content and that school provisions really married up. The last thing, and again, there is the framework, but there's also the entitlement. And Genevieve will talk about the entitlement here in a second. But it's really important to ensure that the school structures and systems are aware of what that entitlement is. So again, like really being clear about what's in the early career framework and what's not is one of the most important things, and certainly some of the things that we're thinking hard about in terms of messaging to trusts and to schools. But also, if I were working for a trust, I would really want to keep an eye on. Because what this isn't about inducting new teachers into your school, but early career teachers. So you might have new teachers that are joining your school who have decades worth of experience, and there might be some content that you need to deliver that's school or trust specific for everybody. But this is an entitlement to the learning. So again, really important that that content, that framework is coming to life, and that there are still some really important bits that you need to induct people into. So that I'm aware was a whistle-stop tour of the framework. Again, really, really important that you spend some time reading it, rereading it. As Tom said, it's been probably under my pillow somewhere, seeping in. But again, it's not just the framework; it is also a whole package of reforms, which I'll let Genevieve discuss a little bit more.
Great, thank you so much, Kyle. We really slowed down the presentation there to take some time to really understand the framework which underpins the reforms. This next section is going to look at, so what does that mean for schools and trusts from September? The slides in this section are going to have lots of values, numbers, funding, so please don't feel like you need to jot down all of the information. We'll share the slides after this presentation, as well as Laura said, there's going to be a recording that you can go back and watch. So we're going to take a quick whistle-stop tour through the actual reforms. So as you know, induction for NQTs previously, which it's now been confirmed that we're officially changing the name of NQTs to ECTs as of yesterday, from September 2021 are changing. So we're moving from a 1-year to a 2-year statutory induction. We're also changing what's happening in the second year of that ECT's classroom timetable. So we're still retaining the 10% reduction in year 1 and moving to a 5% reduction in their timetable in year 2 in order to support them to continue to invest in their professional development. We're also the DfE is also committed to ensuring that they have a mentor through that second year. The number of hours that are allocated to that mentoring are half of that it's expected in year 1, but that mentor still needs to be in place for year 2, and there is an expectation that the mentor and the ECT are working closely together. And from a 1-year PD program, the expectation now is that they are having a PD program rooted in the early career framework, and that lasts for 2 years as part of their induction. So there is funding which is allocated to the second year of the program. So the funding is intended to cover the 5% off timetable for the early career teacher, as well as those hours, the 20 hours for the mentor to be working with the ECT in that year. The funding is published freely on the DfE's website, and as you can see, it ranges from about £2,100 to £2,600, depending on where you are in the country. The DfE did go out and had quite a wide consultancy group, and there's a breakdown on their website of how they came to this money. But as you can see, that there's a distinct difference in what they're expecting to fund the 5% off timetable and that mentor working time with the ECT. So there's really 3 options for schools from September. And this is down to that bottom point, the fact that they need a 2-year professional development program, which is rooted in the ECF. So schools have 3 different things they can do from September. Option A is they can work with one of the lead providers and their network of delivery partners in order to receive a fully funded program from rooted in the core content from the DfE. Option B is schools can deliver their own program using those core induction materials. And option C is schools can design and deliver their entire program from scratch from the ECF, from the framework itself. Excuse me. So option A, program delivered in partnership. Option B, take those 4 products that Kyle's reviewed and create their own ECF program they can deliver in their school. Option C, they can design their own program off of the framework itself and deliver that in school. Now, there's a couple things that we need to consider when making those decisions. One is, how is that program quality assured and who's responsible for that? And the second part is, and how is that funded? So if you go with option A, the program is going to be quality assured by Ofsted. This was part of the formal announcement yesterday the DfE made. Ofsted won't inspect schools, but will inspect lead providers, and will be working with the lead providers network of delivery partners. So yes, they might be coming into schools, but they are going to be inspecting that lead provider. If a school decides that they're going to deliver a program based on the core induction materials, or design and deliver their own program, it's going to be the appropriate body's responsibility to go into those schools and to be quality assuring that statutory induction. If schools and trusts opt for the national program, the DfE is covering the cost of that program and supporting lead providers and their delivery partner network in order to deliver that program. So it's no cost to the school to have that program delivered. But if schools do opt for option B or C, so delivering their own program based on the core induction materials or designing and delivering their own program from scratch, there'll be no funding to schools to do that piece of work. Now, the DfE is aware that if you do opt for a national program, there is mentor training that exists within that program. So we will be working directly with mentors in order to support them to unpick the ECF and support them to unpick the mentoring process that's dictated as part of that national program, that national providers program. So the DfE are providing between £800 and £900, depending on where you are in the country, for each mentor to commit to investing in that program. Again, if a school decides to design or design and deliver their own program, there'll be no funding available for that mentor release time. So this is the first time the DfE have worked under a slightly different model of delivery. The tender that came out in October last year for the national rollout of the framework provision structured it as so. There are national lead providers. There's been 6 national lead providers that have been appointed. And the expectation is that national lead providers are working through regional delivery partners with schools across the country. The regional delivery partners include teaching school hubs, MATs and trusts, local authorities, and teaching schools. So if you decide to go as a trust with a lead provider, you'll be working with them alongside a regional delivery partner to deliver to their schools. Also, if you opt for option A, the tender lays out quite clear criteria for how many hours should be dictated to each element of the program. Now, some of these have been covered in Kyle's section. So you can see the first one is the ECT's self-directed study materials. So the expectation is that there's roughly around 23 hours of materials that are available for the self-directed study materials. There's also taught sessions. There's the mentor sessions that the ECT and mentor are having together. And then there's also taught sessions for the mentor. And you can see for the taught sessions for ECT and mentor, there is a requirement for some of that to be delivered face-to-face. Now, all programs have been QA'd by the EEF and the DfE. As Carl said, it was quite a long, onerous process to go through that. It was around 6 months of quality assurance through various content teams and ministerial sign-off. But it is important to recognize that that all of these will be, these sections will be used differently. These hours be used differently by different lead providers. So when you go on the DfE's website, you look at those core induction materials from the 4 early rollout providers, you'll see slight differences with how much is face-to-face versus virtual, whether or not there's a long conference days, or whether or not there's short sessions that are delivered in school. And so it's really important that you look at what's appropriate for your network. It's also important to know that of the hours, as you total these up, the DfE has been very clear that there are distinct hours for assessment which sit alongside this. I'll give you a moment to read this. So it's really important to remember, to recognize, to remind ourselves that the ECF is not an assessment framework. The ECF reforms, the induction programs that are provided either by national providers or by schools if they want to design and deliver their own program, should not form part of the assessment of the early career teachers. Assessment and the ECF program are separate, and the assessment will still sit with the school's chosen appropriate body. I think it's really important to recognize that the assessment will still continue against the teaching standards and not the early career framework. The early career framework as a document is not expected to be turned into a tick box where we track progress against the statements of the ECF to form part of that teacher's assessment. The new frameworks which have been shared yesterday confirmed that there'll be 2 formal assessment points across the 2-year induction. There'll be one midway through the induction and then one at the end of the induction period. So they're changing from 3 formal assessment points to 2 across the 2 years. They're also expecting that there are regular progress reviews that happen in between those. So any term where there's not a formal assessment, there'll be an expectation that that teacher is still being monitored with their progress against the teaching standards. So again, the key roles of the appropriate body are to ensure that the ECTs receive that statutory entitlement, to ensure that those ECTs are fairly assessed and consistently assessed in line with the framework, and to check to make sure the ECTs are receiving their entitlement. They're receiving a program of support, and that program of support is tracked and is based on the early career framework. Now, there is still a role for the appropriate bodies for the ECF reforms as well. So appropriate bodies can act as delivery partners for lead providers and work directly in schools. They can deliver in schools where they're still acting as an appropriate body as well. And this is slightly different from the early rollout into the national rollout. It's just really important that if that is the case, that appropriate bodies must ensure that those roles are very distinct and that they can demonstrate how they're keeping those roles separate as a delivery partner and as an appropriate body. And we have NTA on the call to be able to help with any of those questions. So now I'm going to hand over to Leila, who's going to speak a bit about some really core barriers that we've found over the last 2 years that trusts should really think about when they're preparing for the effective implementation of the reforms.
Thanks very much, Genevieve. So I'm Leila and I'm the head of ARC teacher training. And as Genevieve says, we've been lucky enough to be part of the early rollout of the early career framework. So I'm going to talk you through 4 lessons that we've learned, which are on the next slide. Okay, so as some of you know, the rollout was expanded to try and mitigate the impact of trainee and ECD vulnerabilities caused by the pandemic. And we were really pleased to have the extra safety net for our teachers. However, we launched the programme in a rush and didn't have enough time to explain the why to school leaders. This meant that initially, some saw the ECF as an additional burden rather than an excellent shift in induction practices. The ECF is a huge step forward in the way that we intentionally train and support new teachers, and it should result in increased professionalisation and the retention of those in who we invest so much. School leaders and induction leads need to understand this and give the ECF time and attention amongst competing priorities. At ARC, we constantly bring staff back to the key message that this is an entitlement for early career teachers based on the best available research, that we're obligated to enact the ECF, but also that it's a development that will make a huge difference in schools, support our students to make progress, and accelerate our post-lockdown recovery. So to my second point, in terms of readying your staff, I'd strongly recommend you begin preparing for the new induction as soon as possible. School leaders, induction leads, mentors, and ECTs themselves need to know expectations for onboarding, curriculum, mentoring, and any learning management systems that they're going to be using. Induction leads may hold the misconception that they'll need to run the ECF in addition to their usual NQT programs, when in fact the ECF program replaces these. We found this confusion often arose out of induction leads conflating new staff induction with the ECF. Clearly, ECTs will need to learn about the policies and systems in place in your schools in the same way as all staff will, but their ECF training is to develop confidence and a firm foundation to begin their careers. The third thing to say is schools need to understand that the biggest change coming out of the ECF is the support and training provided to mentors. Although there are many experienced mentors in the system, they may need to relearn their craft to become instructional coaches. They should be excited by the professional development opportunities this affords them and the transferable skills they'll gain. Some might be nervous about training others using techniques that they don't use themselves, but the resources given by the lead providers are really high quality and will guide them step by step to becoming effective. They'll learn to help ECTs practice with purpose and give feedback in bite-sized chunks. Mentors may initially feel silly practicing, but they'll soon get used to it, and this is where the biggest gains are to be made. Okay, so my last point is about owning the repetition in the curriculum. The ECF is a continuation of the core content framework in initial teacher training. It's based on research and cognitive science, and it aims to build fluency in early career teachers. In the early rollout, we had some complaints that ECTs already knew how to do some of the things in the curriculum. Genevieve, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a curve from Dr. Lemov, and it shows how quickly learners forget. When you learn, you begin forgetting almost immediately, and the rate of forgetting is high. A few hours after learning something, people routinely remember only a small fraction of it. But the great news is that each time you practice recalling what you know, the rate and amount of forgetting is reduced. Therefore, the aim of revisiting content is to support ECTs to retrieve key learning and have the opportunity to ingrain habits and achieve mastery. So my 4 biggest learning points are: explain the why, ready your staff, be prepared for new look mentors, and own the repetition. And I'll now pass over to Patrick Alexander.
Hi there. I don't know if I'm on screen yet, but I'll kick off. So I'm the director of curriculum and teacher development at Inspiration Trust, and I'd like to echo quite a lot of the guidance or the advice from Layla. I think starting early is absolutely critical. We've done early rollout ourselves. And just thinking about what next term is going to be like in schools. SLTs will be challenged again. There's going to be a lot of emphasis on assessment and getting the plans right in April and May for that priority. So I'd recommend that for ECF delivery to get off to the right start next year, you should SLT should be putting in planning meetings in April to start thinking about ECF preparations, and that needs to involve working out next year's time commitments for both mentors and for professional tutors with oversight of induction. Obviously, there are going to be timetabling implications, and that's absolutely vital. So if you have staff in charge of timetabling, make sure that they're aware of that resource being provided for mentors as part of the entitlement. That has thrown up the occasional issue in early rollout. So I'd really emphasize the importance of answering those questions early. And then just making decisions which are going to secure buy-in. So, it's all very well it being statutory, but what you want is mentors who are really enthused about what they're doing. As Layla said, it's going to be a great opportunity for professional development. And, that should secure buy-in, but you might want to also think about whether you want to formalize that professional development. Are you going to collapse the like mentoring responsibility for a few ECTs into one role, like a mentoring lead in schools, that might help. How are you going to train them? I think, if you've got the luxury of choosing between mentors, I would be choosing mentors who are really going to follow through and stick with it, hopefully throughout the 2 years of that ECT induction. This might sound like an obvious point, but if you're operating a big mat, make sure you know who your ECTs are. This sounds a bit silly, but if your list of ECTs isn't up to date, you can waste a lot of time tracking engagement where teachers aren't supposed to be on the program. I would run an ECF focused training day for all next year's mentors in June, because the readiness for September is all. And I'd obviously be thinking about running further training day in the first week back, and then a follow-up in September, and probably doing regular optional drop-ins to support, just to see how it's going for mentors and for ECTs. An end of term review meeting might help to keep coherence going throughout the first year. In terms of flexibility and fidelity, we've touched quite a bit during this session on potential conflicts with existing induction programs. So, if you have a professional tutor in school in charge of staff development, I'd be thinking about getting them to present to heads how they intend to adapt existing plans, by the end of June at the latest. I agree with the ambition of owning the repetition, the possibility for repetition as part of the early career framework that Layla set out. I would also say that, depending on how you're approaching this, there are opportunities for mentors, particularly more experienced mentors, to know where you can adapt materials to avoid unnecessary repetition. We work in a very time poor environment, and I think there'll be an irony about a well-intentioned support framework denting motivation by making tired ECTs repeat stuff when it's late in the day, they've got a stack of marking to do, and there's a long commute ahead of them. So there's a distinction between productive repetition, which supports memory, thinking about Ebbinghouse's forgetting curves, and unnecessary repetition, where that's going to dent motivation. So I think it's important that mentors are conscious of that possibility. And in year 2, I think that there's probably more, and this may not be a priority right now for those who are just starting, but there'll be more room for a more flexible approach in year 2, in terms of what stuff has clearly been covered already, and more opportunity for fruitful discussion of research in year 2. So that's for later. And there is also, I suppose, on alignment. If there's a strongly instructional approach to induction, there are rare moments where that could produce a conflict with an existing school policy. Now, obviously, the ECF is grounded in research, but research changes. Some schools haven't adapted to some of those research outcomes. And there might be rare moments where there is a clash between what's being suggested on the ECF and what the existing school policy is, and that's where the mentor and the professional tutor structure can support and give guidance. In terms of just thinking big picture, the ECF is designed to support, retain, and develop ECTs. And I think sometimes when people say support, what ECTs hear is more work. So as Layla said, it's really important that the plans you put in place get the balance right, or the foundational aims of the ECF won't be met. We want to keep our early career teachers and help them to thrive and make them as good as possible. So your final outcome really needs to be, think about that early career teacher. Do they feel supported by the early career framework? Are they getting the right input at the right time? Of course, the ECF has been carefully sequenced and planned, but it may take the experience and initiative of the mentor to think carefully about how that should be appropriately adapted, while staying within the framework and making sure that the ECT is supported. So keep support at the core of what you're doing. Be flexible if necessary. And yeah, remember that at the center of all this is the experience of the ECT. So try and keep the emphasis on that rather than accountability, and that's how we're going to get early career teachers who are going to thrive.